Hey guys, tonight we're going to wander down one of those strange, slightly gloomy corridors of history. So go ahead and get comfortable, dim the lights, maybe even tuck yourself under the blankets, because this is not a tale of great battles or glorious conquests. No, tonight is about the aftermath, the leftovers of history. Specifically, the kids. Not just any kids, but the poor, awkward children of royals who lost everything. See, history books love to focus on kings and queens themselves, especially when they're strutting around with crowns or getting dramatically executed, or marrying someone completely inappropriate. But after the fall, after the revolution, the deposition, the beheading, what happens to the children they leave behind? That's the story we're drifting into tonight. A tale of displaced heirs, confused toddlers, and occasionally very unlucky teenagers who had the misfortune of being born into the wrong branch of the family tree. So, let's float back in time and start with one of the most famous sets of royal children who probably wished they had been born bakers or shoemakers instead of princes and princesses. The French Revolution's leftovers, the children of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. You already know the broad strokes. They reigned, they spent too much money, people starved, they tried to run away, it went badly, guillotines were involved, end of monarchy, beginning of modern France, yada yada yada. But the children, yes, they were there through all of this. And no, it didn't end well. Louis and Antoinette had 4 children in total. Sadly, 2 died young before the revolution even kicked into high gear. That left just 2, Marie-Therese and Louis Charles. Marie-Therese, the eldest, was a teenager during the revolution. And let me just say, being a teenage girl is already hard enough without mobs screaming for your parents' heads outside your house. When her parents were imprisoned in the Temple prison in Paris, she was locked up too. The family spent their last years together under guard, surrounded by walls and guards who weren't particularly gentle. Her little brother, Louis Charles, had it far worse. He was only 8 when his father was executed. The revolutionaries declared him the new king, Louis XVII, in theory, but then immediately locked him away in solitary confinement, because that's what you do with child monarchs when you don't want them to accidentally inspire royalist uprisings. He was kept in a damp, dark cell, abused, neglected, and basically forgotten by the outside world. He wasted away there for 2 years until he died at the age of 10, the little ting who never ruled. Marie-Therese, however, survived. She was released years later, long after both her parents were gone. And here's where things get, well, awkward, because she was technically the last Bourbon heir of her line. She got shipped around Europe, basically treated like a political pawn, married to her cousin, because of course she did, and lived out her life as the tragic symbol of everything the revolution had tried to get rid of. She was called Madame Royale, which sounds fancy, but in reality it was just a nice way of saying the princess of nothing. So, lesson 1. If your royal parents get guillotined, your options are either dying young in prison or living long enough to become a sad mascot for lost causes.
England's awkward exiles, the children of King James II. Now, let's float over the channel to England. And no, don't worry, I'm not going to drag you through the entire glorious revolution in detail, because the name is misleading. It wasn't very glorious. It was mostly just paperwork and Dutch soldiers. Anyway, King James II of England. Catholic. Not popular. Gets booted off the throne in 1688, replaced by his daughter, Mary II, and her husband/cousin, William of Orange. But what about his children? Well, his older daughters, Mary and Anne, are the ones who betrayed him in the first place. They sided with the revolution that toppled him, which is a very Game of Thrones level of family dysfunction. Imagine your own daughters teaming up with your enemy to replace you on the throne. That's not exactly the warm, fuzzy family reunion energy. But James also had a young son, Prince James Francis Edward, known later as the Old Pretender. He was just a baby when his father was ousted, so, like many deposed royals, he got packed off into exile. The family moved to France, where they became the royal equivalent of couch surfers, relying on the generosity of other monarchs who felt sorry for them. This boy grew up being told he was the real king of England, but in practice, nobody actually let him be king. He spent his whole life trying to reclaim the throne and failing. His nickname says it all, the Old Pretender. Not exactly flattering. And then his own son became the Young Pretender. Yes, that's right, 2 generations of failed royals, both remembered as pretenders. Basically, history's way of saying, nice try, but no. So again, royal kids of failed monarchs don't usually get their crowns back. They just get sad nicknames and die in exile. The sad Habsburg experiment. The children of Emperor Maximilian of Mexico. Now, let's float a bit further, to Mexico in the 1860s. Yes, Mexico had an emperor, briefly, and his story is pure chaos. Maximilian of Habsburg, an Austrian prince, younger brother of the Austrian emperor, was basically recruited by French Emperor Napoleon III to become Mexico's puppet monarch. The plan was simple. France wanted influence in Latin America. Maximilian wanted a crown. So he accepted the job, moved to Mexico, and tried to be emperor. Problem? Mexicans didn't really want him. Revolution broke out. Maximilian was captured and executed in 1867. So, what about the kids? Well, here's the thing. Maximilian and his wife Carlotta never actually had biological children. But in true royal fashion, they adopted 2. Specifically, the grandsons of Mexico's first emperor, Agustín de Iturbide. These poor boys were suddenly declared imperial princes. It sounded glamorous until Maximilian's empire collapsed like a bad soufflé. After Maximilian's death, the boys' royal titles meant nothing. They went back to being ordinary Mexican nobles with the added awkwardness of being remembered as the adopted heirs of a failed foreign emperor. Not exactly a great resume line. One of them, Agustín de Iturbide y Green, ended up in the United States, became a professor, and lived a very unroyal life. Imagine going from being groomed as heir to an empire to grading homework in Washington, D.C. So, if you're keeping score, sometimes the children of failed monarchs don't die tragically. They just quietly fade into middle-class obscurity. So, we've already seen some unfortunate French, English, and Mexican kids dragged into political disasters they never asked for. And honestly, you'd think monarchs would stop having children altogether once they realized how badly this tends to go. But no. Royal dynasties kept producing heirs like they were going out of style. Which means, lucky for us, there are plenty more stories of little princes and princesses whose lives went sideways when their parents lost their crowns. Let's float now toward one of history's most brutal cautionary tales, the Romanovs. The Russian imperial children, the Romanovs who didn't make it. You probably already know the broad outline here. Nicholas II, last Tsar of Russia, a man so famously indecisive that he managed to lose an entire empire between tea time and dinner. His wife, Alexandra, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, lover of Rasputin, and generally not great at reading the political room. And then, of course, their children. They had 5, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and little Alexei. Together, they were known as the OTMA sisters and their hemophiliac brother. For a while, they lived the privileged life of Russian royals, palaces, tutors, jewels, formal portraits where everyone looked like porcelain dolls. But then, revolution. And unlike some of the other exiled royals we've talked about, the Romanovs didn't even get that lucky. When the monarchy collapsed in 1917, the family was imprisoned. They were shuffled from palace to palace, stripped of titles, and finally sent to a grim house in Ekaterinburg. Now, I know what you're expecting. Yes, we're heading toward that cellar scene. But don't worry, we're not going to get graphic. That's not the vibe tonight. Instead, let's focus on the children themselves. These were teenagers, mostly. Olga was 22, Anastasia just 17, and little Alexei only 13. These were children raised to believe they were divinely appointed rulers of 1/6 of the Earth's surface. And then, suddenly, they weren't even allowed outside for walks. It's the ultimate whiplash of royal childhood. One day, you're a princess being fitted for pearls. The next day, you're bored out of your mind, writing diary entries about how you're not even allowed to play the piano because the guards find it too cheerful. The tragic ending is well known. But even if, hypothetically, the Romanov children had survived, what then? At best, they would have ended up as exiles, shuffled around European courts like their English cousin, the Old Pretender. At worst, they'd spend their entire lives as symbols for royalists hoping to restore a throne that wasn't coming back. So the Romanov kids represent the cruelest version of this story, when there isn't even an exile to escape into. The Byzantine monkification program. Now let's move further back in time, to the Byzantine Empire. Ah yes, Byzantium. The empire that loved intrigue so much it basically turned palace coups into a national sport. If you were a Byzantine emperor, you weren't likely to die of old age. More often than not, you were going to get blinded, deposed, or shoved into a monastery. Sometimes all 3. And if you happen to be the child of one of these unlucky emperors, well, congratulations. Your career options just narrowed down to 2. Exile or monastery. One famous case is Emperor Romanos IV. He lost a disastrous battle against the Seljuks in 1071, and his defeat was so embarrassing that people still talk about it as one of Byzantium's worst days. After that, Romanos was deposed, blinded, and packed off to a monastery. And his sons? They were essentially erased from the imperial picture. Too dangerous to let them grow up into potential claimants, but too royal to just quietly ignore. So, monasteries. Lots and lots of monasteries. This was basically the Byzantine equivalent of sending kids to boarding school, except instead of learning Latin and cricket, they were tonsured, dressed in itchy robes, and told to spend the rest of their lives praying. Some adapted. Some tried to escape and stir up rebellion. But most faded into history with nothing to their names except monastic titles. It's a theme we'll see again and again. When a dynasty collapses, the safest way to neutralize the children is to turn them into holy men and women. because once you've been forced into a monastery, it's a little hard to come back and say, "Hi, remember me? I'm your rightful emperor."
Ottoman princes in the cage. Speaking of forced retirement plans for royals, let's wander to the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans had let's call it a very unique system for handling royal children. See, they had this problem where every time a sultan died, his sons would fight each other to the death for the throne. Very Game of Thrones, very messy. So, eventually, they came up with a solution: the kafes, or the cage. This was not an actual bird cage, but a part of the palace where potential heirs were locked up. Princes would spend years, even decades, inside these gilded prisons, waiting to see if they'd ever be called to rule. The idea was simple: keep them alive, but isolated, so they couldn't gather support or cause trouble. In practice, it was basically solitary confinement with cushions. Some princes emerged from the cage completely unprepared for life. One sultan, Mustafa I, had spent so long in confinement that when he finally became sultan, he couldn't handle the job. He was paranoid, erratic, and apparently believed fish were giving him political advice. So, for Ottoman royal children, the fall of a dynasty didn't always mean death. Sometimes it meant a very long, very boring life sitting in a luxurious prison, slowly losing your grip on reality. And honestly, that might be worse. The Stuart children who watched a kingdom collapse. Now let's drift back west, to England again, because the Stuarts, oh, the Stuarts, were practically professionals at losing crowns. Let's talk about Charles I. You know, the king who decided he didn't really need Parliament, accidentally triggered a civil war, and eventually got his head chopped off in 1649. He left behind several children, including two boys who became kings in very different ways, Charles II and James II. But when their father was executed, they weren't kings yet. They were just kids on the run. Charles was 18 at the time and had to flee England disguised as, get this, a servant. He even spent one legendary night hiding in an oak tree to avoid capture. Not exactly the glamorous life of a prince. Meanwhile, his younger siblings were scattered across Europe, relying on whichever royal relative was willing to feed them. It was the ultimate royal couch surfing experience. Eventually, Charles II did get his throne back in 1660, during the Restoration. But those years in exile shaped him deeply. He was witty, charming, and cynical, because nothing teaches you skepticism than watching half your family executed and spending a decade begging for other monarchs to lend you money. So here we see one of the rare cases where a child of a failed royal actually makes a comeback. But even then, it was a rough road.
So far, we've mostly looked at sons, little princes locked in cages, stuffed into monasteries, or sent wandering through Europe in exile. But let's not forget the royal daughters. Because if you were a princess and your parents managed to lose their crowns, your life options weren't much better. Actually, they were sometimes worse. Boys could at least pretend to be kings in exile. Daughters, meanwhile, were usually just political chess pieces waiting to be married off to someone inconvenient. So tonight, we drift into their stories, the daughters who inherited nothing but carried all the baggage. The Stuart princesses, pawned in marriage. Let's swing back to the Stuart dynasty for a moment. Remember Charles I, the guy who lost his head in England's Civil War? Well, his daughters were also caught up in the fallout. Henrietta Anne, the youngest, was shipped off to France at the tender age of 3. Why? Because when your dad is executed and your mom flees the country, somebody has to babysit. In this case, that someone was her French relatives. She grew up in the French court, married her cousin, the Duke of Orleans, because of course she did, and spent her life tangled in French palace drama. She got sucked into all the infighting of Louis XIV court, which, if you know anything about Versailles, was basically the 1600s version of a toxic workplace sitcom. She died young, at 26, under mysterious circumstances. Poison was suspected, because in 17th century France, it always was. Meanwhile, her sister Mary married William of Orange. Yes, the same William who later invaded England and stole the throne from their brother, James II. So, congratulations, Mary. Your marriage ended up helping depose your own family. Thanksgiving dinners must have been awkward. So for Stuart daughters, the pattern was clear. You got married into foreign courts, became pawns in other people's dynastic struggles, and probably died young. Not exactly a Disney ending. Napoleon's sad son, the King of Rome. Let's float over to the 19th century, where Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who tried to conquer all of Europe while wearing increasingly fancy hats, also left behind a child who paid for his downfall. Napoleon's only legitimate son was Napoleon Francois, grandly titled the King of Rome. From birth, he was supposed to be the continuation of his father's empire. The whole Napoleon dynasty thing was meant to start with him. But then Waterloo happened. Napoleon was sent off to St. Helena to die slowly while writing his memoirs. And little Napoleon Francois? He was only 4 years old. The Allies shipped him off to Austria, where he was raised by his mother's family, the Habsburgs. The Austrians, naturally, weren't eager to let a Bonaparte grow up and reclaim France. So they gave him a new title, Duke of Reichstad, and quietly kept him under lock and key until tuberculosis killed him at age 21. So the King of Rome ended up being a king of absolutely nothing. His short life was basically a tragic epilogue to his father's story. The French nicknamed him l'Aiglon, the little eagle, which sounds poetic, but in reality, he never got to leave the cage. Spanish princesses in exile. Let's drift to Spain now, where revolutions seem to happen about once a decade in the 19th century. When Queen Isabella II was deposed in 1868, she packed up her things, grabbed her children, and ran off to France. Her daughter, Maria de las Mercedes, grew up in exile, a princess without a throne, shuttled between hotels and borrowed palaces. Now here's the fun twist. Maria eventually married King Alfonso XII of Spain. Yes, she literally married her way back into the Spanish monarchy. It was kind of like uninstalling an app and then reinstalling the exact same version later. Unfortunately, she died within a year of becoming queen from typhoid fever, because, of course she did. Nothing says failed royal child like finally reclaiming your spot on the throne, only to lose it almost immediately to a waterborne disease.
The many daughters of deposed Byzantine emperors. Back in Byzantium, royal daughters often had it even rougher than their brothers. If your dad lost the throne, you could expect to be shipped off into marriage with some obscure foreign ruler. Sometimes you were married to cement an alliance, sometimes just to get rid of you as a political problem. Take Anna of Savoy, for example. She was married into the Byzantine imperial family, and when her husband died, she was left in the middle of a civil war. Her son, John V, was supposed to inherit, but she spent years fighting to protect his claim, basically raising a child emperor in the middle of political chaos. And if you think medieval teenagers were moody, imagine being a teenage boy who's technically emperor, but whose mom is running everything while half the court is plotting against you. For Anna's daughters, it was even awkwarder. They were married off into minor European courts. their fancy Byzantine titles meaning less and less as the empire crumbled. It's like being the child of a failing tech startup CEO. Once the company collapses, all you're left with is a fancy business card that doesn't open any doors. The inconvenient Bourbon girls. The Bourbons of Spain and France also produced their share of royal daughters who ended up as collateral damage. One example is Infanta Maria Teresa, daughter of Charles IV of Spain. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808, the whole royal family basically got kidnapped and shipped to France. Maria Teresa ended up stuck in exile, while Spain descended into chaos. She eventually married her cousin, again because apparently every European princess had to marry a cousin, but spent most of her life in the shadow of her family's disgrace. Her brothers squabbled over thrones, while she quietly faded into obscurity. So yet again we see the pattern. Royal daughters of failed monarchs didn't usually get executed. They just got married off, exiled, and forgotten. Which, depending on your point of view, might be worse. The lost children of the German Kaisers. Let's fast forward to the 20th century, to Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, the guy with the dramatic mustache who helped steer Europe straight into World War I. When Germany lost the war in 1918, Wilhelm fled into exile in the Netherlands. And what about his kids? Well, he had 7 of them. Imagine being one of 7 children of the man everyone blamed for a world war. Not exactly great for the family resume. His eldest son, the Crown Prince Wilhelm, was supposed to inherit the German throne. Instead, he spent the rest of his life floating awkwardly around Europe, occasionally dabbling in politics, occasionally being ignored. His younger children tried to live more private lives, but they carried the stigma of being Kaiserkinder, the children of a failed emperor. Some served in the military, some married into other noble families, but none ever reclaimed the throne. And honestly, by the 20th century, royalty was losing its shine anyway. So they ended up as relics, awkwardly aristocratic in a world that didn't care anymore.
So far, most of the children we've talked about ended up dead, imprisoned or married off into oblivion. But sometimes fate took a weird turn. Sometimes the children of failed royals lived on in odd little niches, reinventing themselves, clinging desperately to old titles, or being remembered for things that had nothing to do with crowns. Let's float into those stranger corners of history tonight. The Brazilian imperial kids who ended up in Paris. Let's begin in Brazil. Yes, Brazil had emperors once. The last emperor was Dom Pedro II. He was overthrown in 1889, and his whole family was sent into exile. His daughter, Isabel, was technically the Princess Imperial, the heir. She was also the one who signed the Golden Law that abolished slavery in Brazil, which should have been a shining legacy. But when the monarchy fell, Isabel and her children were shipped off to Europe. And where did they end up? Paris, of course, because if you're a 19th century royal exile, Paris is basically the waiting room of history. Her sons grew up there, not as future emperors, but as aristocrats drifting through European salons, drinking too much coffee, and reminiscing about the empire they'd never rule. One of them, Prince Pedro de Alcantara, eventually renounced his claim to the Brazilian throne just to marry a Czech noblewoman. Imagine giving up an empire, even a theoretical one, for love. Or maybe he just didn't feel like being the exiled emperor who never was. So, the children of Brazil's last monarch ended up as European socialites, their crowns replaced with Parisian cafe tables. The Emperor of the United States.
Now, to be clear, Norton wasn't the child of a failed monarch, but he became the symbolic heir of all of them, an eccentric in 19th century San Francisco who declared himself Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico. Why bring him up here? Because he shows what happened when all those children of failed royals who once dreamed of empires were replaced by someone who just made it up. Morton lived in poverty, issued his own fake currency, and was beloved by the locals as a kind of harmless, quirky figure. In a way, he was the Tarity ending for the real stories we've been talking about. If you lost your crown, someone else would eventually just play emperor for laughs. The Bonaparte cousins who wouldn't let go. Now, remember Napoleon's sad son, the Duke of Reichstadt? He died young. But the Bonaparte family wasn't done producing awkward heirs. Various cousins and nephews kept popping up across Europe, insisting they were the rightful heirs of Napoleon's legacy. The most famous was Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon's nephew, who actually managed to become Napoleon III, Emperor of the French. He pulled off a comeback, for a while, until he lost a disastrous war against Prussia in 1770 and was overthrown again. And yes, he had a son, the Prince Imperial, Napoleon Eugene. Poor kid was supposed to continue the dynasty. Instead, he died in South Africa at the age of 23 while serving with the British Army, killed by Zulu warriors. So, there you have it. From Emperor of Europe to dead in a colonial war. Not exactly the imperial trajectory the Bonapartes had in mind. The Little Princes of India after 1857. Let's drift now to India. After the Indian Rebellion of 1857, the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah II, was deposed by the British. He was sent into exile in Burma, where he lived out his final days as a forgotten old man. But what about his children? Most of his sons were captured by the British, and here's the grim part. Some of them were executed on the spot. Others were sent into exile with their father, stripped of titles and forced into poverty. For a dynasty that had once ruled almost the entire subcontinent, it was a humiliating fall. The Mughal princes became ordinary exiles, with nothing but fading memories of Delhi's Red Fort. A few descendants survived quietly into the 20th century, living obscure lives in Rangoon and beyond. Imagine being the great-great-grandson of the Mughal emperors and nobody around you even cares anymore. That's what happens when history leaves you behind. The exiled Greek princes who became British. The Greek monarchy was another case of constant collapses. Kings came and went like badly reviewed Netflix series. One of the most famous children of failed royals here was Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark, better known later as Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, husband of Queen Elizabeth II. Yes, the man who spent most of his life 2 steps behind the British Queen started out as a Greek royal baby on the run. In 1922, when he was still an infant, his father was exiled from Greece after yet another political disaster. The family fled on a British warship, and little Philip was famously carried out of the country in a fruit basket. Not exactly a regal cradle. So Philip grew up essentially stateless, bouncing between relatives in Europe until he reinvented himself as a British naval officer. From there, he married Elizabeth, and the rest is very long royal history. Technically, he was one of those children of failed royals, but unlike most, he landed on his feet very firmly. The pretender who never stopped pretending. One of the strangest cases was Prince Michael of Russia. He was a grandnephew of Tsar Nicholas I, and when the Romanovs were toppled, he ended up in exile like so many others. But unlike most, he never gave up on the idea of returning. He styled himself head of the Imperial House of Russia for decades, even though nobody in Russia was asking for him. He gave interviews, issued manifestos, and basically lived out his life as a man whose title existed only on paper. And honestly, that's the fate of many children of failed royals. Not death, not even poverty, but a kind of awkward, lifelong cosplay, dressing up as something that no longer existed, insisting the crown was still theirs, even as the world moved on.
We've wandered through the sad little rooms of history where royal children ended up exiled, imprisoned, forgotten, or reinvented as parlor ornaments. But some of them slipped into something stranger, the realm of legend. Some became symbols, others were whispered about as if they were still alive long after death. And a handful, against all odds, actually turned the wheel of fortune and climbed back to power. So let's end tonight's long drift through dynastic gloom with the most haunting afterlives of all. The Lost Dauphin of France. We can't talk about myth without starting here. The French Revolution is famous for chopping off heads. Louis XVI lost his, and Marie Antoinette followed. But what about their son? Louis Charles, known as the Dauphin, was locked up in the Temple prison in Paris. He was just 8 years old when the revolutionaries decided to re-educate him, which, translated, meant confining him in filth, neglecting him, and allegedly abusing him until he died at the age of 10. At least, that's the official story. But here's where legend creeps in. Rumors spread that the real Dauphin had been smuggled out. Over the decades, dozens of men across Europe popped up claiming to be the lost boy king, grown up. Each one insisted they were Louis XVII, survivor of the revolution, rightful king of France. None of them were convincing. DNA tests later confirmed that the child in the Temple prison really had died there. But the myth was so strong that for more than a century, people believed the little prince might still be alive, waiting to reclaim his throne. That's what happens when royal children die too young. History fills in the gaps with fairy tales. The Romanov Pretenders. Speaking of fairy tales, let's glide forward to Russia. The Romanovs, toppled by revolution in 1917, were executed in a basement in Yekaterinburg. Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children, all gone. Or were they? Because just like with the lost Dauphin, the legend of survival immediately took off. Most famously, people whispered that Grand Duchess Anastasia had escaped. Throughout the 20th century, women came forward claiming to be Anastasia. The most famous was Anna Anderson, who convinced some people for decades that she was the lost princess. She had supporters too, minor royals, old servants, desperate monarchists who wanted to believe. DNA testing in the 1990s finally settled it. No, she wasn't Anastasia. The Romanov children had all died in 1918. But the legend had already taken on a life of its own. Even Disney eventually turned it into a musical, complete with songs, magic, and a happy ending that never actually happened. The real story? Just another set of failed royal children murdered young. The legend, a bedtime story about escape, survival, and reclaiming a crown.
The Hawaiian heirs who became symbols. Not all legends were about survival. Some children of failed royals became enduring cultural symbols. Take the Hawaiian monarchy. Queen Liliuokalani, the last monarch, was overthrown in 1893 when the United States decided it wanted Hawaii. Her heirs never regained power. But instead of fading into European cafe society, her successors became icons of Hawaiian identity. Princess Kaiulani, the young heir, was particularly celebrated. She was half Scottish, half Hawaiian, raised partly in Britain, and beloved for her intelligence and beauty. She toured America, pleading for Hawaiian independence. Sadly, she died young, at just 23, from illness.
But in Hawaii, she became a romantic figure, the princess who symbolized what was lost. Unlike the forgotten Mughal princes or the cafe-haunting Bonapartes, Kaiulani became part of cultural memory, a reminder that royalty isn't always just politics. Sometimes it's identity. The Stuart pretenders who wouldn't quit. Now, for the rare kids who kept pretending long after their chance was gone. When James II of England was deposed in 1688 during the Glorious Revolution, he fled into exile. But his son, James Francis Edward Stuart, nicknamed the Old Pretender, spent his entire life insisting he was the rightful King James III. He passed that claim on to his own son, Charles Edward Stuart, the Young Pretender, or more famously, Bonnie Prince Charlie. Charles actually tried to take the throne back during the Jacobite Rising of 1745. For a brief moment, it looked like he might succeed. He marched his army deep into England before being forced to retreat. When he lost at the Battle of Culloden in 1746, it was all over. He spent the rest of his life drinking, sulking, and being a disappointment to everyone around him. So here's the takeaway. When royal children refuse to let go of crowns, they usually end up being remembered not as kings, but as pretenders. And in the long run, pretenders are just footnotes. Romantic, tragic, slightly pathetic footnotes. The lucky ones. A few comebacks. Of course, not every child of a failed royal stayed failed. Some managed comebacks that history barely saw coming. The best example? Charles II of England. His father, Charles I, was executed in 1649, a failed king if there ever was one. The monarchy was abolished, and England became a republic under Oliver Cromwell. Charles II spent years in exile, bouncing around Europe, broke and mocked. He was the classic child of a failed royal. But then Cromwell died, the republic collapsed, and suddenly everyone decided, you know what, let's just bring the monarchy back. Charles was restored to the throne in 1660 in what was literally called the Restoration. He went from penniless exile to king again. It was rare, almost unheard of. And Charles made the most of it, throwing parties, keeping mistresses, and earning the nickname the Merry Monarch. So yes, sometimes the wheel of history does spin back around, but usually only once in a generation. The final drift. So what happens to the children of failed royals? Most of the time, nothing good. They're prisoners, exiles, or forgotten. Some reinvent themselves, others cling to ghostly titles, and a few become symbols bigger than their real lives. Occasionally, legends grow around them. The lost Dauphin, Anastasia, Bonnie Prince Charlie. These stories are comforting because they suggest maybe, just maybe, the fall of a crown isn't the end. But history is rarely that kind. Most of these children lived quiet, strange, or sad lives, their names remembered only because they were once near power. And tonight, as you drift off, you can let those stories fade into the background hum of history, little echoes of crowns that glittered, fell, and left behind only children with nowhere to go.
By now, we've seen every depressing fate in the book. Execution, prison, poverty, pretending to be kings when nobody cared. But some royal children didn't just fade or fail. They wandered off into odd, almost comic detours. So tonight, let's drift into those stranger stories, the ones where the children of failed royals reinvented themselves in ways nobody would have predicted. The Habsburg who became a monk. The Habsburgs are famous for their chin, their inbreeding, and their habit of losing wars despite owning half of Europe. But occasionally, a younger son or failed heir just gave up. Take Archduke Maximilian Francis of Austria, the youngest son of Empress Maria Theresa. While his siblings were busy ruling vast empires, getting executed in France, or scheming in politics, Maximilian ended up as a churchman. He became Archbishop of Cologne, which, to be fair, was a powerful position, but it was also a way of saying, "You'll never be emperor, so here's a cathedral instead." So while his siblings shaped dynasties, Maximilian spent his days in ecclesiastical robes, basically a glorified Habsburg monk. Not the worst fate, but definitely not the imperial life he was born into. The Byzantine princes who ended up in Italian backwaters. After the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, died defending the city. But what about his relatives? Some of his nieces and nephews fled west, ending up in Italy. A few married into minor Italian noble families, living out their lives in sleepy towns, always clinging to the title of Prince of Byzantium. Imagine going from the glittering palaces of Constantinople, the second Rome, to being an awkward in-law in a crumbling villa in Naples, the ultimate downgrade. Generations later, descendants were still popping up in dusty records, insisting they were heirs to Byzantium. By then, nobody cared, but they kept the dream alive anyway, because sometimes it's easier to live in a fantasy than admit your empire is gone.
The French princess who became a nun. Sometimes the escape hatch for failed royal children was religion. Take Louise of France, daughter of Louis XV. She was technically a princess of France, but after a lifetime in a court famous for extravagance, mistresses, and general chaos, she took the veil and became a Carmelite nun. It was a dramatic change, from silk gowns and Versailles gossip to barefoot prayer in a cloister. Some said it was penance for her father's sins, others said she just couldn't handle court life. Either way, she chose silence and prayer over dynastic politics, which is one way of dealing with royal dysfunction. Opt out entirely. The Bourbon who became a scientist. Believe it or not, a few failed royals actually tried intellectual work. Take Prince Louis Victor de Broglie from the French Bourbon orbit. His family's power had long since collapsed, but generations later, one of his descendants, Louis de Broglie, became a physicist, and not just any physicist, a Nobel Prize winner, famous for his theory of wave-particle duality. Yes, a family once obsessed with wigs, wars, and marriages ended up producing a man who literally changed modern physics, which feels like history's way of saying, fine, you can't run a country, but maybe you can figure out quantum mechanics. The royal kids who just liked parties. Not every royal child ended up tragic or saintly. Some just leaned into decadence. Take the later Bourbons of Naples. After Napoleon toppled their kingdom, some of the royal offspring spent exile in Rome, throwing endless parties. No crowns, no armies, just soirees. For them, losing a throne wasn't the end of the world. It just meant fewer official duties and more time to drink, gamble, and gossip. And honestly, that might have been the smartest survival strategy of all.